seed.
And then it turned into a bush, then it turned into a great big tree.
Exactly. It was a tiny seed, but you watered it, and it turned into a bush, and then it turned into a great big tree. There's a tree. Yeah. And we learned that we grow with God, right? And you don't just, when you grow with God, you don't just grow on the outside. You grow on the inside, and that means you grow to be able to love God and love each other even more.
What does that sign say?
It says Bible Look. That's because we tell Bible stories here. Okay, today I have 3 stories for you. Okay? And the first one, they're all 3 about Jesus. Yesterday we told the story that Jesus told. Today all 3 of the stories are about Jesus. The first story is about a youngster who was very, very, very sick. Had a high fever, was so sick that his father was worried about him. I imagine that some of you have had a fever or have felt bad one time or another, and your parents really worry about
My
it.
dad is a doctor, and he takes care of people when he's in the hospital and he don't call.
I know that. I know he takes care of people. He takes care of a lot of people. I tell you what, can I tell this story and then ask if you would ask me questions or make comments at the end of the story? Hold on to those questions, okay? I'll ask you then. Well, his father was so worried about him that he wanted to find someone who could help him. So he had heard about Jesus. Jesus went around healing people and helping them, and so he went to find Jesus. He looked and looked and looked, and when he finally found Jesus, he ran up to him and he said, "You've got to help me. My son is very sick. He has a fever. You've got to come to my house and help me." And Jesus said, "Don't worry. Your son's fine."
Why?
You haven't come to see him. You haven't touched him. I mean, Jesus said, "You can go home. Your son's fine."
Why did
So the
he get
man
sick?
believed him. We don't know why he got sick. But the man believed him, and he started for home. Well, he was a long way from home, so it was the next day that he saw some people coming his way, just like I happened to see you guys coming in when you were coming in quietly.
Yeah.
Except these were his servants, and they were coming from his house. And they started running toward him when they saw him, and they said, "Your son is well. Your son is fine. The fever broke, his temperature went down, and he's just fine." And when the man asked about what time the fever had gone down, they said, "Oh, about 1 o'clock yesterday afternoon." And he realized that that was exactly the time that he had been talking to Jesus. So he and his whole family became followers of Jesus. Now, there was another man who was stretched out because he couldn't walk. His legs didn't work and hadn't worked for over 30 years. Hadn't worked for over 30 years. He did, but they didn't have wheelchairs in those days. Now, there were lots of people around this pool. It looked kind of like a swimming pool, but not exactly. But every now and again, the water would start to bubble and bubble and bubble and bubble. And they said that if the first person got in the pool quicker than anybody else, they would be healed. So there were lots of people who couldn't see, who couldn't walk, who couldn't hear. Lots of people who had been sick for a long time lying around there just waiting for the water to bubble so they could be the first one in. So Jesus came up to this man who was lying beside this pool on a mat. And he said to him, "You want to get better? You want to get well?" First that seemed like kind of a silly question. Of course he did. But the man said, "Every time the water starts to bubble up, somebody else is quicker. They get in there before I can, and I never have a chance. My legs don't work. How can I get in there before anyone else?" Jesus just looked at him and said, "Take up your mat and go home." The man hadn't walked for over 30 years. He thought, "I'm not even sure I can move my toes, much less roll up my mat and go home." But he started to try to move his toes, and his toes worked. And he started to stretch out his legs, and his knee worked. Both knees worked. He tried. He was a little wobbly at first, but he tried really hard to stand up. And when he stood up, his legs held him up. This was amazing. He had not done this in over 30 years. But then he remembered, I have to roll up my mat. So he had to lean back down, roll up his mat, he put it under his arm, and he took his first step, and then his second step. And pretty soon he was walking just like everybody else walking on the street. Well, this happened to be on a day called the Sabbath, which is supposed to be a day of rest. And there were some really, really, really religious people who saw him carrying his mat. And you weren't supposed to work, and carrying your mat was considered to be work. So they said, what are you doing carrying your mat? Don't you know this is a day of rest? He said, yeah, but that guy over there who healed me told me to pick up my mat and take it home. So they went to Jesus, and they were not happy. They said, don't you know this is the Sabbath? Aren't you a teacher? Don't you know this? He's not supposed to work on the Sabbath, and you tell him to pick up his mat and go home? And Jesus said, well, you know, God is at work on the Sabbath, and God heals people, and I'm helping God. So I'm at work on the Sabbath too, at least when it comes to healing people. Well, they didn't like his answer very much, but that man who could walk loved it. Now to our third story. Jesus went to a lake. The lake is called Gennesaret, but we know it as the Sea of Galilee. Okay? You may have heard that that's the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus decided that he would teach his disciples and whoever else wanted to come and listen. So he sat down and he began to teach. Now, in the olden days, when a rabbi, a teacher, had something important to say, something they thought would be really helpful, they would sit down. And that was a signal to everybody, this is important. Now, when we preach today, people stand up because they want to say, this is important. I have something I think is helpful. But it was just the opposite at the time of Jesus. He sat down and everybody knew that this was important. So he began to teach, and more people began to gather. And all through the day, more and more and more and more, until finally there were 5,000 people gathered around him. Well, it was getting toward the end of the day. People were getting hungry, and the disciples were getting hungry. And one of them, whose name was Philip, came to Jesus and said, I think it's about time to stop. I think these people are hungry. We need to send them home so they can get something to eat. And Jesus said something that sounded really pretty silly to Philip. He said, you feed them. Philip said, we don't even have enough food for ourselves, much less 5,000. Can you imagine 5,000 people? Are there maybe 20 people sitting around here? Oh my goodness, 5,000. And Jesus said, well, what do you have? Show me what you have. Well, there was a youngster, maybe about your age, who had brought a lunch or a dinner. It was 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Not enough to feed 5,000 people.
Actually, it was.
Don't give away the ending. Well, they started passing them around. And people would take a piece of bread and pass it on. And pretty soon they passed out all the bread and all the fish. And before you know it, everybody had had enough to eat. And Jesus said, well, collect what's left over. You wouldn't think anything would be left over, would you? But when they collected it, it filled 12 baskets. So when that youngster decided to share and work with Jesus on this, everybody had enough. So we work with God. That's our phrase for today, right? We work with God.
We work with God.
Now, questions or comments?
We work
Okay,
with
you
God.
say jump.
Make sure
Okay,
to
one
raise
at a
your
time.
hand and let other friends have
One
turn so they
at a
can
time.
hear.
Yes, ma'am.
I have had stitches before.
You have. Oh my goodness.
What?
Oh my
You just wait
goodness.
till you're sweet.
You were very brave to get stitches. Yes.
Today at my time, I got a bug bite and it really hurt.
Oh my goodness. Some of those bug bites really do hurt, don't they? Yes,
I
sir.
got a mosquito.
Everybody needs to listen so I can hear too, okay?
First, why tell they could use only one dinner or in lunch. To make 50,000 people get all of their food.
It is amazing, isn't it? It really is an amazing story. Yes, sir.
Bit by a wasp.
Ooh, that really hurts.
So did my brother on the foot.
I've been bit by a wasp before, and I know that hurts.
Excuse me, my brother got.
Yes, sir.
I'm gonna tell 3 things. One time when I was sick, I was way too sick because, and I'm like shooting a germ down the throat, and I got stung by a wasp before. Oh, and actually, when going after I get picked up, there's electric wires to keep the away so we don't leave it out in the garden. If someone touches it, and it will really, really, really bad. It'll probably shock your boat. Well, it's like
Claire,
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Why can bread and fish 5,000 people?
How in the world did they feed those 5,000 people? I tell you what, it was just God's doing, I think.
I know
And
how.
all of that,
It just reminds me of when I was
Samuel.
they